Modern dating has never offered more choice, more visibility, or more ways to meet people. In theory, this should be the easiest time in history to find connection. Millions of profiles exist within reach of a single screen. A few taps, a few swipes, and suddenly you're introduced to people you might never have encountered in the past. On the surface, the system looks almost limitless. And yet, a growing number of men quietly describe the exact opposite experience. Instead of endless opportunities, they encounter silence. Instead of attention, they encounter invisibility. At first glance, this contradiction doesn't seem to make much sense. How can a world filled with millions of profiles still leave so many men feeling like they barely exist inside the system at all? But once you begin to understand how attention actually moves inside modern dating, that contradiction starts to make a lot more sense. Because beneath the surface of dating apps and social platforms, something else is happening. Something subtle, something structural. Modern dating doesn't just operate as a social environment. In many ways, it behaves much more like a market. And like most markets, attention inside it does not distribute itself evenly. A small number of profiles receive enormous visibility. Matches arrive quickly. Conversations begin easily. Momentum builds almost automatically. Meanwhile, many other profiles circulate through the same system almost silently, not necessarily rejected, simply rarely seen. And once you begin to notice this pattern, the entire landscape of modern dating starts to look different. Because the real question may not be why some men struggle in dating. The real question may be something deeper. How exactly does attention move inside the modern dating market? And what happens to the men who rarely enter its field of visibility? To understand that, it helps to start with a very ordinary example. A man whose life from the outside looks completely normal. Someone like Daniel. Daniel is 31 years old. His life, by most reasonable standards, is stable. He has a steady job, a small circle of friends, he goes to the gym a few times a week, pays his bills on time, keeps his apartment reasonably clean. Nothing about Daniel's life suggests chaos or failure. If you met him at work or at a social gathering, you would probably describe him the same way many people do. Quiet, normal, the kind of person who blends easily into the background of everyday life. And like many men his age, Daniel eventually decided to try modern dating. Not because he was desperate, not because he believed in some fantasy about apps solving his life, simply because this is where meeting people now tends to happen. So one evening, he downloaded a couple of the major dating apps. He chose a few photos that seemed decent enough, nothing overly polished, nothing dramatic, just pictures that looked like him. He wrote a short description, simple, honest, a few lines about work, hobbies, and the kind of life he was building. At first, Daniel didn't expect miracles. He understood that dating apps were competitive. Everyone says that. So he approached it with reasonable expectations. He swiped occasionally, sent a few messages, and waited to see what would happen. And during the first few weeks, nothing about the experience seemed especially strange. But as the weeks slowly turned into months, Daniel began noticing something subtle. Not rejection, not harsh responses, something quieter than that. Most of the time, nothing happened at all. Very few matches, very few replies, very few signs that anyone had even noticed he was there. At first, Daniel assumed it was just bad luck. Maybe the algorithm needed time. Maybe he needed better pictures. Maybe everyone else was just getting started too. So he made a few adjustments. He updated his photos, changed parts of his profile, asked a couple of friends what they thought, and for a short time that gave him a sense of optimism. Maybe the system simply needed a little calibration. But after a while, the same pattern quietly returned. Silence. And that silence began to produce a different kind of question in Daniel's mind. Not, why did she reject me, but something far difficult to answer.
Was I even seen in the first place? And this is where the experience of invisibility often begins. Not with a dramatic moment, not with a clear rejection, but with a quiet pattern that slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Because when someone rejects you, there is still an interaction to process, a message, a conversation, a moment you can point to. Invisibility is different. Invisibility removes the moment entirely. There is no clear event, no explanation, no feedback. Only the quiet feeling that your signal might not even be reaching anyone at all. And once that thought begins to settle in, something subtle starts to change. Because Daniel's experience is not nearly as unique as he first assumed. In fact, once you begin looking closely, the same pattern appears again and again.
Across different apps, across different cities, across different groups of men. Which raises a deeper question. If so many men are quietly describing this same experience, what exactly is producing it? At first, most men assume the answer is personal. Maybe their photos aren't good enough. Maybe their messages are too simple. Maybe they just need to improve themselves a little more. And that reaction is completely understandable. When something repeatedly fails in our lives, the first instinct is usually to assume the problem is ourselves. But the story becomes much more interesting once you start asking a different question. What if part of the experience isn't just personal at all? What if the environment itself quietly distributes attention in ways most people never notice? Because once that possibility enters the picture, modern dating begins to look very different. And this is where the story becomes much more complicated. Because Daniel is not the only man who eventually begins to notice this pattern. There are others who have lived with it for much longer. Men who have watched this shift unfold slowly over many years. Men like Marcus. Marcus is 42. In many ways, his life looks even more stable than Daniel's. He has spent years building his career. He owns a small home. His finances are under control. From the outside, Marcus looks like someone who did many of the things people are told will eventually create stability. Work hard, build a life, stay disciplined. And for most of his adult life, dating was simply one part of that larger picture. When Marcus was younger, rejection was something he experienced from time to time. But rejection, while uncomfortable, still felt normal. Someone showed interest, a conversation happened. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Even when the answer was no, the interaction itself still existed. He was in the room, he was part of the process. But over the years, something about the experience began to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually. The feedback started to fade. Conversations became less frequent. Matches appeared less often. And eventually, something unfamiliar began to replace rejection. Silence. At first, Marcus interpreted it the same way Daniel did. Maybe he needed better photos. Maybe he needed to improve his profile. Maybe the timing was wrong. So he made adjustments. He updated his pictures, improved his fitness, read articles about messaging strategies and attraction psychology. For a while, those changes seemed promising, but the overall pattern remained strangely similar. The silence still returned. And after enough time passed, Marcus began to notice something about the emotional difference between rejection and invisibility. Rejection hurts, but invisibility feels different. Rejection creates a moment, a clear event the mind can process. Invisibility creates something much more subtle: erosion. It slowly changes how a person interprets their place inside the environment, not because someone explicitly told them they were unwanted, but because the system repeatedly suggests they might not even be relevant. And once that idea begins to settle in, something deeper starts to shift. Because the human mind is designed to interpret patterns. When something happens repeatedly, we naturally try to explain it. We search for reasons, we search for causes. And when a man repeatedly feels invisible inside the dating environment, the explanation often becomes internal. Maybe I'm not attractive enough. Maybe I'm not interesting enough. Maybe I'm simply not the kind of man anyone notices. But there is another possibility that many men rarely consider at first. What if part of the experience isn't only about the individual?
What if part of the pattern is built into the environment itself? Because once you begin looking closely at how modern dating platforms operate, a different picture begins to emerge. A picture that looks less like traditional social interaction and more like a system where attention moves in very specific ways. And in systems like that, something interesting tends to happen. Attention doesn't spread evenly, it concentrates. Some profiles receive enormous visibility, while many others move through the system quietly in the background. Not necessarily rejected, simply surfaced less often, seen less frequently, placed in front of fewer people. And once you begin to recognize this dynamic, Daniel's experience starts to look very different. Because the question may not always be, why did no one respond? The deeper question may be, how often was he actually being seen in the first place? And this is where the idea of a dating market begins to make sense. Because markets rarely distribute attention equally. They amplify visibility. Some profiles receive enormous exposure. Others remain largely unseen. And when millions of people are competing for attention inside the same environment, even very small differences in visibility can produce very large differences in outcome. One profile appears slightly more often.
Another appears slightly less. One receives a few early matches. Another receives none. And over time, those small differences begin to compound. Because attention has momentum. Profiles that receive attention early often receive even more attention later. Matches lead to conversations. Conversations build confidence. Confidence improves interaction. And the cycle continues. But when attention rarely appears at all, the opposite cycle can begin. Silence creates doubt. Doubt reduces initiative. Reduced initiative produces even less visibility. And eventually, something subtle begins to happen inside the person experiencing it. Because when invisibility repeats itself long enough, it stops feeling temporary. It starts to feel permanent. And this is where the real psychological shift begins. Because once you start looking at modern dating through the lens of visibility, something important becomes easier to understand. Dating today is not only a social environment, it is also an environment shaped by attention. And attention, by its nature, behaves very differently from the way people imagine social interaction working. In traditional social spaces, attraction had time to develop. People met through friends, through school, through workplaces, through repeated encounters over weeks, months, sometimes even years. Familiarity had time to grow. Personality had time to reveal itself. Someone who was not immediately impressive could still become interesting over time. But modern dating environments operate under very different conditions. Profiles appear for only a few seconds, sometimes only a fraction of a second. A photo appears, a quick impression forms, a decision is made, and then the next profile replaces it almost instantly. In environments like this, attention becomes the most valuable resource. And when attention becomes the primary resource inside a system, something predictable begins to happen. It concentrates. A relatively small number of profiles receive a very large share of the visibility, while the majority circulate through the system with far less exposure. This pattern is not unique to dating apps. It appears in almost every environment driven by fast attention. Social media, streaming platforms, online marketplaces. In each case, a small portion of participants tends to receive a disproportionate amount of visibility, while most others remain much harder to discover. And once you understand this dynamic, something about modern dating begins to look less mysterious. Because the difference between two people's experiences inside the system may not always come down to effort or personality. Sometimes the difference begins much earlier, at the level of visibility itself. One profile is shown frequently, another is shown far less often. One person receives early interaction, another receives none.
And in systems shaped by attention, early interaction matters more than most people realize. Because attention creates momentum. When a profile receives attention early, the platform has a signal that engagement exists. The system begins to surface that profile more often. More visibility leads to more matches. More matches lead to more conversations, and more conversations reinforce the cycle. Meanwhile, profiles that receive little early interaction often experience the opposite pattern. Less interaction produces fewer signals. Fewer signals reduce visibility. Reduced visibility leads to fewer opportunities. And slowly, the gap between those two experiences begins to widen. This is why two men can enter the same dating environment and experience completely different realities. One encounters constant opportunities, the other encounters almost nothing at all. Not because one of them is fundamentally unworthy of connection, but because visibility inside the system does not distribute itself evenly. And once this dynamic becomes large enough, it begins to shape how people interpret their entire experience of dating. Someone who receives attention regularly experiences the system as full of opportunity. Someone who rarely receives attention experiences the system as silent and confusing. Both people believe they are participating in the same environment, but in practice, they are experiencing completely different versions of it. And once you begin to see this clearly, something else becomes easier to understand. The emotional experience many men describe today is not always driven by rejection. Sometimes it is driven by something far more difficult to process: absence. Because rejection still contains a moment. A conversation happened, a decision was made. Invisibility removes that moment entirely. There is no interaction to analyze, no feedback to interpret. Only the quiet feeling that your presence might not be reaching anyone at all. And when that experience repeats itself long enough, the mind begins to search for explanations. Most men initially assume those explanations are personal, but in many cases, the structure of the environment itself plays a far greater role than they realize.
Because when attention becomes the gatekeeper of connection, visibility becomes the most important currency inside the system. And like most currencies, it rarely distributes itself equally. Which means that for many men, the most difficult part of modern dating is not rejection. It is the experience of moving through an environment where their signal rarely enters the field of attention in the first place. And this is where the situation begins to look very different from the way most people initially interpret it. When people talk about struggles in dating, the explanation almost always focuses on the individual: confidence, appearance, social skills, self-improvement. And while all of these things certainly matter, they don't fully explain the pattern many men quietly experience today. Because when the same feeling appears across thousands of different individuals in different cities, different ages, and different backgrounds, it begins to look less like personal failure and more like a structural pattern, a pattern produced by the environment itself. Modern dating environments operate inside something that closely resembles an attention economy. And in attention economies, visibility rarely spreads evenly. Instead, it concentrates. A relatively small number of participants receive a large share of the exposure, while the majority operate with far less visibility. This doesn't mean those individuals are fundamentally unattractive, or incapable, or socially broken. It often means something much simpler. They are participating inside a system where attention moves quickly, decisions happen rapidly, and small differences in visibility can create enormous differences in outcome. And once you understand this, a powerful shift in perspective begins to happen. Because the experience many men interpret as constant rejection may not always be rejection at all. In many cases, the real experience is something quieter.
They are simply not entering the field of attention often enough for interactions to begin. The problem, in other words, is not always that someone looked at them and said no. Sometimes the problem is that no one looked long enough to make any decision at all. And that distinction changes how the entire situation looks. Rejection implies evaluation. Invisibility implies absence. Rejection means the system noticed you. Invisibility means the system may never have surfaced you in the first place. And once that idea becomes clear, many of the confusing emotional experiences men describe in modern dating suddenly start to make more sense. Because the system is not only selecting, it is also filtering. And those filters determine who receives attention and who moves quietly through the background. Which leads to a realization that many men arrive at slowly, often after years of confusing experiences. Modern dating does not simply reward effort, it rewards visibility. And visibility is not distributed evenly. Some men live inside a stream of constant interaction. Others move through the same environment, almost unseen. Not because they are fundamentally unworthy of connection, but because they exist inside the quieter side of the attention market. And once you recognize that structure, something important changes. The problem begins to look less like a personal mystery and more like the natural outcome of how attention behaves inside modern digital environments. And once this structure becomes part of a man's repeated experience, something subtle begins to change in the way he approaches dating itself. Not all at once, and not always in ways that are immediately visible from the outside. Because when people imagine men struggling in dating, they often picture dramatic reactions, anger, frustration, loud complaints. But for many men, the reality looks much quieter than that. The more common response is something far less visible. They begin to try a little less. Not because they suddenly stopped wanting connection, but because the repeated experience of invisibility slowly changes their expectations. When someone repeatedly feels that their presence barely registers inside the environment, initiative starts to feel heavier. Sending a message feels less promising. Starting a conversation feels less natural. Approaching someone begins to carry more doubt than curiosity. And over time, those small shifts in behavior begin to accumulate. A man who once tried often begins trying occasionally. A man who once tried occasionally begins trying rarely. And eventually, something else begins to happen. He starts reorganizing parts of his life in ways that require less emotional uncertainty. Work becomes a clearer source of progress. Friendships feel more predictable. Hobbies feel more controllable. And slowly, dating begins to move toward the edges of his life. Not necessarily because he consciously decided to abandon it, but because the psychological cost of repeated invisibility quietly outweighs the expected reward. From the outside, this shift can be easy to misinterpret.
It may look like indifference, or a lack of emotional distance, or a lack of effort. But beneath the surface, the process often began much earlier, long before the man stopped trying. It began with the repeated experience of not being noticed, of sending signals that seemed to disappear into silence, of feeling present in the environment, but somehow absent from the attention within it. And once that pattern becomes familiar enough, something deeper begins to change. Because expectations shape motivation. If a man expects that his presence will rarely be acknowledged, the motivation to initiate slowly begins to fade. Not because he stopped valuing connection, but because the environment repeatedly suggested that connection might not include him. And over time, this quiet transformation in the way many men relate to dating itself. Not anger, not resentment, but distance. Distance becomes a way to protect energy, a way to avoid repeatedly stepping into environments where attention rarely appears. And this is one of the least visible consequences of modern dating environment. From the outside, it may simply look like men are losing interest in dating. But in many cases, what actually disappeared first was the expectation that the effort would lead anywhere at all. And once expectation disappears, effort often disappears with it. And once to begin to understand this structure, the conversation around modern dating starts to look different, because the usual explanations often focus entirely on the individual. Improve yourself, work harder, become more confident, optimize your profile. And while self-improvement will always matter in some form, it doesn't fully explain the environment many people are navigating today. Because modern dating is no longer just a social space, it is also a visibility system. And in systems like that, the distribution of attention plays a powerful role in shaping outcomes. This doesn't mean personal responsibility disappears, but it does mean the environment itself influences how often someone even has the chance to be evaluated in the first place. And that distinction matters, because when a man interprets repeated invisibility purely as personal failure, the psychological effect can become unnecessarily heavy. He may assume something is fundamentally wrong with him, when in reality, part of what he is experiencing may simply be the natural behavior of an attention-driven environment. Understanding this doesn't magically solve the challenges of modern dating, but it does change the way the experience is interpreted. Instead of asking only, "What is wrong with me?" a different question begins to appear. What kind of environment am I actually participating in? Because once you recognize the structure, something important becomes clear. Modern dating does not always function like traditional social life. In traditional environments, familiarity creates opportunity. In attention markets, visibility creates opportunity. And visibility is never perfectly evenly distributed, which means some people will naturally occupy the spotlight of attention, while others move through quieter parts of the system, not rejected, simply unseen. And once that dynamic becomes visible, many of the emotional experiences men quietly describe today begin to make much more sense. The silence, the confusion, the gradual withdrawal. These are not always signs of bitterness or resentment. Sometimes they are simply the natural response to participating in an environment where attention behaves very differently than people expect. Which leads to a final question that is becoming increasingly important. If modern dating environments are shaped by the movement of attention, how many people are quietly disappearing from the possibility of connection without ever fully understanding why? Because the story of modern relationships is not only about who is chosen, it is also about who is never seen. And perhaps the most important step in understanding modern dating is not simply learning how to compete inside the system, but learning to recognize the structure of the system itself. If this perspective resonated with you, consider subscribing. This channel explores the patterns and hidden dynamics many people experience in modern relationships, but rarely hear explained clearly.